Welcome back to the Bible Stories. As you watch today, you will notice there are no ads playing on this video. That is because YouTube has completely demonetized our channel. We now depend on support from viewers like you to keep making these videos. If the videos on our channel have blessed your life, please consider supporting us by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the link in the description. There is a terrifying reality buried in the pages of the Bible, and it begins with a man who had absolutely everything. Imagine a leader who receives a direct supernatural gift from God, a mind so brilliant and profound that rulers from all over the known world travel across harsh deserts just to hear him speak. He builds the most glorious and expensive structure the earth has ever seen. He brings an era of unmatched peace, stunning architecture, and breathtaking prosperity to his people. He is given the greatest wisdom ever granted to a human being. Yet, by the end of his life, this exact same man becomes the reason his own nation is destroyed. His brilliant reign ends in dark failure, spiritual ruin, and divine judgment. The tragic story of King Solomon proves a very hard and uncomfortable truth. Having the greatest wisdom in the world means absolutely nothing if you do not have the daily obedience to actually use it. The book of 1 Kings is not just a dusty history lesson about ancient royalty and forgotten empires. It is a profound, unfolding drama about human weakness, the seductive and quiet power of false gods, and the relentless faithfulness of the God of Israel. It shows us exactly how a great and powerful nation falls apart from the inside. It reveals that spiritual drift does not happen all at once, but rather through tiny, unseen compromises. And it introduces the vital, dangerous role of the prophets, men like Elijah, who stepped out of the harsh wilderness to speak the absolute truth of God to wicked leaders who refused to listen. When you truly understand the book of 1 Kings, you understand the great breaking point of the Old Testament. You see exactly why the Promised Land was torn into two fighting, bitter kingdoms. You witness the severe consequences of a broken covenant. And most importantly, you begin to see the deep, desperate need for a perfect king who would never compromise. To step into the world of 1 Kings, you have to understand exactly what is at stake. This book picks up the grand story of Scripture right where the book of 2 Samuel comes to an end. King David, the great warrior, and the man after the heart of God, is old, weak, and dying. A new king must take the throne, and the transition of power is full of tension. The entire nation is waiting to see what will happen to the royal family. But there is something deeper holding this entire story together. God had made a very specific, unbreakable promise to David. God swore that his royal family line would continue forever. This promise is the invisible thread that holds the entire chaotic book of 1 Kings together. As you read through the decades of history in this book, you will see kings fail, rebel, and lead the people into deep darkness. Yet, even when the kings who follow David fail completely, God preserves a descendant of David on the throne in the city of Jerusalem simply because he refuses to break his word. As David fades into history, his son Solomon rises to absolute power. The beginning of his reign feels like the ultimate golden era of human history. The bloody wars of David are over. The land is resting in profound peace. God appears to Solomon and offers him anything he desires. Solomon does not ask for the death of his enemies or for endless wealth. He asks for a listening heart to govern the people well. God is so deeply pleased with this humble request that he grants him wisdom, along with unprecedented riches and honor that he did not even ask for. The Bible tells us exactly how vast and overwhelming this gift was. And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and breadth of mind like the sand on the seashore. With this brilliant, unmatched mind, Solomon begins the greatest project of his entire life. He builds the magnificent temple of God in Jerusalem. For centuries, the presence of God had dwelled in a humble, movable tent as the people wandered the desert and fought for the land. Now, Solomon constructs a breathtaking, permanent house of worship filled with carefully cut stone, rare, fine wood, and pure gold. It is a monumental achievement. It stands as the absolute peak of the nation of Israel. But right in the middle of this glorious, unmatched success, the writer of 1 Kings drops a quiet detail. It is a bright red flag about where the true devotion of the king really lived. Solomon spent 7 years building the glorious temple of God, but he spent 13 years building his own massive palace. It is an easily missed detail, but it reveals a deep, dangerous crack in the foundation of his heart. Solomon is dedicating almost twice as much time and resources to his own house as he is to the house of God. His heart is slowly shifting from serving the Lord to elevating himself. He is becoming fascinated with his own legacy, his own comfort, and his own worldly glory. This is how the descent into darkness begins. Spiritual drift happens very slowly. Solomon did not wake up one morning, look out over the beautiful city of Jerusalem, and decide to hate the God who gave him everything. His heart was pulled away over many long years, one small compromise at a time. In the ancient world, it was very common for kings to marry princesses from other surrounding nations. This was not about romance or love. It was the standard, accepted way to secure political peace treaties and build strong alliances. Instead of trusting God to protect his borders like his father David did, Solomon leaned entirely on his own brilliant political strategy. He began to practice this ancient worldly custom, and because he had endless wealth, he took it to an extreme, horrifying degree. He took 700 wives and 300 concubines. This was a direct, blatant violation of what God had explicitly commanded for the kings of Israel in the law. God had warned that multiplying wives would turn the heart of the king away. And the danger was not just political or financial. The danger was entirely spiritual. When these hundreds of foreign wives moved into the royal city of Jerusalem, they did not leave their religions behind. They brought their local gods, their idols, and their dark temple practices with them. Solomon wanted to keep his political alliances strong and his wives happy. So he began to build altars for their false gods, right on the hills facing the holy city of Jerusalem. The wisest man on the face of the earth began to bow down to silent, dead statues of wood and stone. The builder of the temple of God was now funding the worship of false idols. The turning point recorded in the text is devastating to read. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. Many readers look back at history and think that Solomon was only famous for being a brilliant, perfect, and wise king. They love to quote his proverbs, but they completely forget that his obsession with foreign women, extreme wealth, and endless armies ruined his heart and destroyed his nation. There is a very common assumption among believers today that Solomon repented of his dark idolatry and returned to God at the very end of his life, before he died. But the terrifying truth is that the book of 1 Kings never states that Solomon repented. His story in this book ends in divine judgment and absolute failure. We can see the terrible cost of his obsession with wealth in his dealings with his allies. Solomon needed immense, constant building materials for his endless royal projects. To pay for these materials, he gave 20 cities in the region of Galilee to King Hiram of Tyre. Think about the deep spiritual tragedy of this single transaction. For generations, the people of Israel had fought, bled, and trusted God to inherit the Promised Land. Every piece of ground was a sacred inheritance from the Lord. But Solomon treats the Promised Land like cheap currency. And the ultimate insult comes when Hiram travels to inspect these 20 cities. He looks at the land, shakes his head, and calls it worthless. Solomon was trading away the sacred inheritance of God to fund his own lavish lifestyle, and the world did not even value what he gave them. Before we continue with the current video, I want to show you a quick trailer for our Bible quiz app. Let's take a look. Think you know the Bible? Let's put your faith to the test. Play every day to grow your wisdom and build a strong habit that stays with you. Enjoy fun, quick quizzes that help you learn and remember the Bible better than ever. Earn faith points, level up, and climb the global leaderboard. Unlock the stories of the Bible today. Download now. Because of this deep, fundamental betrayal of the covenant, the judgment of God finally falls upon the house of Solomon. God sends a message that changes the course of biblical history forever. The great, united, wealthy nation of Israel is going to be violently ripped apart. God does not speak this judgment to Solomon first. He speaks to a servant of Solomon named Jeroboam. A prophet finds Jeroboam on the road, tears a new piece of clothing into 12 pieces, and hands 10 of them to the servant. And he said to Jeroboam, "Take for yourself 10 pieces, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Behold, I am about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon, and will give you 10 tribes." God declares that he will leave only one tribe for the son of Solomon. He makes it completely clear that he does not do this because Solomon deserves any mercy. He does it solely for the sake of David, honoring the covenant he made with his faithful servant years before, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city he chose. When Solomon finally dies, his son Rehoboam takes the throne. Rehoboam is foolish, harsh, and utterly lacking the deep wisdom of his father. The people of Israel are exhausted. They come to Rehoboam with a very simple request. They ask him to lighten the heavy burden of forced labor and crushing taxes that Solomon had placed upon them to fund his glorious building projects. They promise that if he will simply be a servant to them and show them mercy, they will serve him forever. Rehoboam asks the older, wiser men who had served his father for advice. These seasoned elders tell him to listen to the people, speak good words to them, and show them kindness. But Rehoboam rejects the good counsel of the elders. Instead, he turns to his arrogant, inexperienced friends who grew up with him. These young men are drunk on royal power. They tell him to threaten the people, insult them, and make the brutal burdens even heavier to prove his dominance. Rehoboam listens to his prideful friends. He speaks harshly to the nation. This moment proves a profound truth. The voices you choose to listen to will absolutely shape your future. Rehoboam lost most of his kingdom in a single day because he rejected wisdom and decided to listen to arrogant flatterers. The people immediately rebel. The 10 northern tribes break away entirely and form their own independent nation, taking the name Israel. Rehoboam is left ruling only the tiny southern kingdom, which is called Judah. People reading this story often think the split of the kingdom was just a political argument over heavy taxes and forced labor. They view it as an ancient economic dispute, but the Bible makes it clear that the heavy taxes were simply the trigger. The absolute root cause of the division was the spiritual idolatry of Solomon. The kingdom of Israel did not break apart because of bad politics or weak economic policies. It broke apart because of a broken covenant with God. When leaders compromise and worship false gods, the entire nation suffers the bitter consequences. Now, the golden era is dead. There are two rival kingdoms. The southern kingdom of Judah is ruled by the family of David from the capital city of Jerusalem, where the magnificent temple of God still stands. The northern kingdom of Israel is ruled by the former servant Jeroboam. Jeroboam immediately faces a deep psychological and political problem. He knows that the temple of God is located in the south. He realizes that if his new northern citizens continue to travel down to Jerusalem to worship at the temple, their hearts might eventually soften and return to the family of David. He is terrified they might reunite the kingdom and assassinate him. Driven entirely by his own fear and a desperate desire to hold on to his new power, Jeroboam commits a catastrophic, defining sin. He creates a complete counterfeit religion. He makes two calves of solid gold. He places one in the city of Bethel in the south of his territory, and the other in the city of Dan in the far north. He sets up these idols and tells his people that it is simply too much trouble for them to travel all the long way down to Jerusalem to worship God. He offers them a convenient, easy alternative right in their own backyard. But notice carefully what Jeroboam does. When he presents these golden calves to the northern kingdom, he does not tell the people to worship a brand new god. He does not ask them to abandon their history. Instead, he uses the exact same words that Aaron used in the desert centuries earlier when the Israelites built the very first golden calf at Mount Sinai. He points to the golden statues and says that these are the gods who brought them up out of the land of Egypt. Jeroboam shows us a terrifying reality about deception. False religion often looks exactly like true religion, just made a little more convenient and comfortable for the flesh. He twisted true worship into something false, but deeply familiar to the people. He appointed his own priests who were just regular men, completely ignoring the tribe of Levi that God had chosen. He invented his own religious festivals to mirror the true holy days. He built an entire religious system that looked somewhat spiritual on the outside, but was completely disconnected from the truth and authority of God. This tragic sin becomes the defining mark of the entire northern kingdom. From this moment on, for the rest of the book of 1 Kings, every single ruler of the north is compared to Jeroboam and condemned by God for following in his dark footsteps. As the years pass, the timeline of 1 Kings moves steadily downward. The book tracks the complicated history of both the northern and southern kingdoms, moving back and forth between the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. It covers about 120 years of turbulent history, tracing a slow, steady spiritual decline. The specific timeline and dating of when each king ruled is sometimes difficult for modern readers to calculate perfectly. This is because fathers and sons occasionally ruled at the exact same time in what is called a co-regency. But the exact dates are not the main focus of the writer. The exact author of 1 Kings is actually never named in the biblical text. Many Jewish scholars and historians believe the weeping prophet Jeremiah wrote it, while others argue it was compiled by a group of unknown prophets during the dark years of the exile. But regardless of who held the pen, the divine purpose of the book is perfectly clear. The writer of 1 Kings evaluates every single king based on one absolute strict standard. That standard is whether the king remained faithful to the covenant of God and kept the worship of the nation pure. In our world today, we naturally judge our leaders by their growing economy, their brilliant military victories, or the wealthy cities they build. The Bible completely rejects this worldly measurement. The Bible judges them by their devotion to God alone. There are kings in this book who won great military battles, expanded their national territory, and built incredible wealth. Yet the writer dismisses their earthly success in a single sentence and calls them evil simply because they worshipped idols. On the other hand, kings who destroyed the false idols and worshipped God alone are called good, regardless of whether their political or financial administration was successful. God weighs the heart of a nation by its worship, not its wealth. This strict standard brings us to the darkest, most terrifying era in the history of the divided kingdom. A man named Ahab rises to power as the king of the northern kingdom of Israel. The Bible gives him a devastating, chilling summary. King Ahab did more evil in the sight of the Lord than all the kings who lived before him. He treated the terrible sins of Jeroboam as if they were a light, easy thing. Ahab marries a foreign princess named Jezebel. Jezebel is not just a casual worshipper of false gods. She is a radical, militant fanatic. She aggressively and violently forces the worship of the false god Baal onto the entire nation of Israel. She uses the massive wealth and resources of the state to feed hundreds of false prophets at her own table, and she begins a systematic, bloody campaign to hunt down and murder the true prophets of God. There is a very common misunderstanding that Jezebel was the supreme ruler of the northern kingdom of Israel. Because she is so famous for her wickedness, people assume she held the ultimate authority. But the Bible shows that Ahab was the actual king. Jezebel had massive influence and terrifying power to manipulate him and order executions, but she operated entirely within his royal authority. Ahab was the one responsible before God. He was the weak, wicked leader who stood by and gladly allowed his wife to fill the promised land with darkness and innocent blood. To understand why this era was so offensive to God, you must understand the cultural background. The people of the ancient Near East believed that Baal was the supreme god of the world. They believed he was the ultimate rider of the clouds. They believed he controlled the rain, the fierce storms, the lightning, and the fertility of the crops. The people of Israel began to deeply compromise their faith. They tried to worship the God of heaven out of tradition, while also bowing down to Baal out of fear, just to ensure their farms would prosper and they would have enough food. The entire nation was utterly lost in a fog of spiritual confusion and idolatry. Right in the middle of this deep, suffocating spiritual darkness, God raises up a lonely voice. Out of the harsh, unpolished wilderness steps a bold, rough prophet named Elijah. He does not come with an army. He does not come with political negotiations. He comes with the absolute authority of the living God. God sends Elijah directly into the royal court to face King Ahab with a staggering, impossible message. Elijah stares at the most wicked king in history and declares that as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, there will be neither dew nor rain in the years ahead except by his word. And then, as quickly as he appeared, Elijah vanishes back into the harsh wilderness. Elijah prays, and the sky turns to iron. It does not rain for 3 years and 6 months in the land. The flowing rivers dry up into dust. The green crops fail and wither. The ground cracks open under the blazing sun. A deadly, terrifying famine grips the entire region. You must realize that this devastating drought is not just a random natural disaster. It is a highly specific, perfectly calculated judgment from God. Because the people falsely believed that the idol Baal controlled the rain and the storms, God shut the sky completely. He proved to the entire starving nation that the God of Israel alone controlled the rain, while Baal was utterly, pathetically powerless. The drought was a direct theological war against a false god. While the rebellious nation starves under the judgment they brought upon themselves, God protects his faithful prophet. He sends Elijah to hide in deep isolation by a remote brook called Cherith. And here, in the quiet of the wilderness, we see a beautiful, unexpected detail about the miraculous provision of God. God commands ravens to feed his prophet. The text says the ravens brought Elijah bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, while he drank fresh water from the running brook. This detail is absolutely stunning when you understand the culture. To the Jewish people reading this text, ravens were strictly considered unclean birds under the law of Moses. They were wild scavengers. Yet God deliberately used these unclean wild birds to bring daily miraculous food to his greatest prophet during a deadly famine. It shows that God is never limited by human expectations or religious boundaries. He can use absolutely anything and anyone to sustain those who remain faithful to him in dark times. After 3.5 long agonizing years of absolute drought, the brook finally dries up. God tells Elijah that it is time to stop hiding and show himself to King Ahab. The suffering of the nation has reached its peak. It is time to definitively settle the burning question of who is truly God in Israel. Elijah commands Ahab to gather all the starving people of Israel and the hundreds of false prophets of Baal to a place called Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel was a prominent, highly visible peak, a place where ancient altars were often built. The entire nation drags themselves up the mountain to watch. They are exhausted, starving, desperate, and waiting to see what will happen between this lone prophet and the royal court. Elijah stands alone before the massive, silent crowd. He does not offer them a soft, comfortable sermon about feeling better. He confronts their divided, compromising hearts directly. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, "How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him." And the people did not answer him a word. The profound silence of the crowd is tragic. They are so spiritually numb, so completely battered by years of compromise, that they cannot even bring themselves to agree that the Lord is God. They just stare at him in silence. Elijah proposes a simple, terrifying test. Both sides will build an altar of stone. Both sides will prepare a sacrifice of a bull. But neither side is allowed to light a fire under the wood. The God who answers by sending fire from heaven, he is the true God. The people finally nod and agree that this is a fair test. The hundreds of prophets of Baal go first. From the early morning until noon, they shout to the empty sky. They dance wildly around their altar. They cry out for Baal to hear them. Elijah begins to openly mock them, suggesting that perhaps their God is asleep, or perhaps he is busy traveling. As the hot afternoon wears on, the false prophets become completely desperate. They draw their weapons and begin to violently cut themselves with swords and spears until blood flows freely all over their bodies. This was not just dramatic behavior. This was a very real, documented pagan practice in the ancient world. It was a desperate blood sacrifice meant to wake up the gods, to show their devotion, or to force the gods to finally pay attention. It shows the absolute, blinding cruelty of false religion. It demands your blood, it demands your dignity, and it gives you absolutely nothing in return. When the evening finally comes, the bloody altar of Baal is still perfectly cold and entirely silent. There is no voice. There is no answer. Then it is the turn of Elijah. He quietly calls the people near. He takes 12 stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel and rebuilds the ruined altar of the Lord. He places the wood and the sacrifice on the altar. And then, to make the coming miracle absolutely undeniable to every skeptic in the crowd, he orders the people to pour 4 heavy jars of precious water all over the sacrifice and the wood. He makes them do it 3 times until the water runs down and completely fills the trench around the altar. Elijah steps forward. He does not shout at the sky. He does not dance or cut himself. He simply prays, a quiet, powerful, grounded prayer, asking God to prove that he is the Lord. that Elijah is his servant, and that God is actively turning the hearts of the people back to him. Instantly, terrible fire falls from the open heaven. It does not just burn the meat of the sacrifice. The holy fire of God is so intense, so overwhelmingly powerful, that it completely consumes the meat, the soaked wood, the heavy stones of the altar, the dust of the earth, and it entirely licks up all the water sitting in the trench. Nothing is left but a scorched mark on the mountain. The fire falling on Mount Carmel was not just a magic trick designed to impress a stubborn crowd. It was a direct, aggressive declaration of war on the false god of storms to prove exactly who truly controlled the sky. It was God stepping into the physical world to defend his holy name. The terrified people fall flat on their faces and cry out repeatedly that the Lord, he is God. The false prophets of Baal are immediately judged and destroyed. And shortly after this great victory, Elijah tells Ahab to eat and drink because he hears the sound of a heavy rain. The sky grows dark with thick clouds, the wind blows, and the rain finally pours down upon the thirsty, cracked land. God has completely won. You would naturally think that after calling literal fire down from heaven, destroying hundreds of false prophets, and ending a 3-year national drought by the power of prayer, Elijah would feel utterly invincible. You would expect him to march directly into the capital city, overthrow the wicked royal family, and lead a glorious national revival. But the book of 1 Kings refuses to hide the raw, unfiltered reality of human nature. Believers reading this text often assume that Elijah was fearless, bold, and entirely unshakable at all times. But the text shows us something deeply surprising. Right after his greatest, most public miracle on Mount Carmel, the news of the dead prophets reaches the palace. Queen Jezebel is enraged. She sends a direct death threat to Elijah, swearing by her false gods that she will make him a dead man within 24 hours. Elijah, the great hero of faith, completely breaks. After facing down hundreds of dangerous false prophets without flinching a single muscle, Elijah panics and runs for his life from one angry woman. He runs away in absolute terror. He leaves his servant behind and goes alone deep into the harsh wilderness. He shows us that even the strongest, most anointed heroes of faith face dark moments of total panic and severe spiritual burnout. He finally collapses under a solitary broom tree. He is completely exhausted, deeply depressed, and emotionally empty. He prays and actually asks God to end his life. He says he is no better than his ancestors. He feels that he has completely failed to change the nation, and he just wants the pain and the pressure to be over. Notice very carefully how God responds to this broken prophet. God is incredibly gentle with our mental and physical exhaustion. When Elijah was depressed, suicidal, and wanting to die under that tree, God did not appear in a storm to yell at him for having weak faith. God did not preach a harsh, demanding sermon at him about his lack of courage. Instead, God gave him the gift of deep sleep. An angel touched him gently and provided freshly baked bread and a cool jar of water. God let him sleep again, and then the angel woke him and fed him again. God tenderly attended to his physical breaking point before he ever addressed his deep spiritual despair. Strengthened by that supernatural food, Elijah travels for 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb. This is the very same mountain where God had given the holy law to Moses centuries before. Elijah finds an empty cave and goes inside to hide from the world. God finally speaks and asks him a simple question. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah pours out his bitter, broken complaint. He says that he has been very jealous for the Lord, that the people of Israel have broken the covenant, torn down the altars, and killed all the other prophets. He firmly believes that he is the only believer left on the entire earth, and now they are trying to kill him too. He feels completely, utterly alone. God tells Elijah to step out of the cave and stand on the mountain, for the Lord is about to pass by. First, a great and powerful wind tears the mountains apart and shatters the heavy rocks. But the text tells us the Lord is not in the violent wind. After the wind comes a terrifying, ground-shaking earthquake. But the Lord is not in the earthquake. After the earthquake comes a blazing, destructive fire, but the Lord is not in the fire. And after the fire comes a quiet whisper, a still, small voice. When Elijah hears the whisper, he pulls his heavy cloak over his face in deep reverence and steps out to the entrance of the cave. God spoke to Elijah not in the violent wind, the shaking earthquake, or the blazing fire, but in a quiet whisper. He showed the exhausted prophet that God often meets our loudest, most chaotic panic with profound, quiet peace. There is a widespread idea today that the still, small voice of God that Elijah heard is exactly how the Holy Spirit speaks to every Christian today. People often use this story to describe their own internal feelings. But the text actually describes a highly unique physical event where God spoke an actual, audible message to a specific prophet hiding in a cave. God used this specific, quiet moment to show Elijah something vital. God was showing him that his divine work was not just found in the loud, dramatic miracles like fire from heaven or ending droughts. His work was also in the quiet, unseen, relentless work of preserving a faithful people. God gently corrects the broken perspective of Elijah. He gives him a new mission, telling him to anoint new kings and a new prophet to take his place. And then God tells him a staggering truth. God tells him that he's not alone. God always preserves a faithful remnant. Even when the nation was completely drowning in dark idol worship, even when Jezebel was hunting believers, God kept 7,000 people hidden safely who had never bowed their knees to Baal and never kissed his image. You can never perfectly measure what God is doing by what you can see with your own eyes. Elijah was convinced he was the only believer left on earth, while God had 7,000 others standing firm in the shadows, quietly sustained by grace. 1 Kings gives us one more sharp, uncomfortable look at the dark character of King Ahab before the book draws to a close. Ahab has a massive royal palace. He has immense wealth, military power, and authority over the entire nation. But right next to his royal palace is a small, simple vineyard owned by a regular citizen named Naboth. Ahab decides he wants this vineyard. He wants to dig it up and turn it into a vegetable garden because it is close to his house. He offers to buy it or trade for it, but Naboth refuses. Naboth explains that the land is his sacred family inheritance, given by God to his ancestors, and he cannot lawfully sell it to the king. Naboth is honoring the ancient law of God. King Ahab, the powerful ruler of the nation, goes back to his palace, lies down on his bed, turns his face to the wall, and absolutely refuses to eat. He pouts. He had everything a royal ruler could possibly want in the world. But he acted like a miserable child over a small vegetable garden. This moment proves a terrifying reality about human nature. Unchecked sin will always make you greedy for more. No amount of wealth or power will ever satisfy a heart that is far from God. You will always find one more thing you must have. When Queen Jezebel sees Ahab sulking on his bed, she mocks him for his weakness and takes matters into her own wicked hands. She takes the royal seal, writes official letters in the name of Ahab, and arranges for 2 false witnesses to publicly accuse Naboth of cursing God and the king. The wicked plot works perfectly. Innocent Naboth is dragged out of his own city and brutally stoned to death. When Ahab hears the news, he does not mourn the murder of an innocent man. He gladly gets out of bed and goes down to take possession of the stolen, bloody vineyard. But God sees every single hidden sin. He sees the blood of Naboth soaking into the ground. He sends Elijah out of the wilderness one more time to meet Ahab right in the middle of the stolen vineyard. Elijah delivers a crushing, absolute prophecy of doom against Ahab and the entire house of Jezebel. The judgment of God cannot be outrun by royal power. The blood of the innocent cries out to heaven, and the righteous God answers. When we step back and look at the entire sweeping scope of the book of 1 Kings, we see a tragic story of deep, profound failure. We see a glorious united kingdom completely destroyed by the quiet compromise and idolatry of Solomon. We see a divided nation pushed into ruin by the fearful, false religion of Jeroboam. We see the heavy darkness of Ahab and Jezebel and the desperate, exhausted struggle of Elijah trying to hold back the tide of evil. The deeper, foundational truth running through this entire historical book is that human kings will always fail you. Political power cannot change a wicked heart. Endless wealth cannot buy spiritual purity. A brilliant mind cannot save you if you refuse to obey God. This tragic history was not written just to make us feel sad about ancient Israel. It was written to point us directly to the profound, absolute need for Jesus Christ. Jesus himself taught that he is greater than Solomon. While Solomon had immense worldly wisdom, he failed miserably in his personal obedience. His heart was divided by his lust and his wealth. Jesus is the perfect, eternal King of peace who never compromised a single time. His heart was perfectly united to the will of the Father. Solomon built a physical, glorious temple made of cut stone and gold, a building that would eventually be utterly destroyed by foreign armies. But Jesus builds an eternal living temple made of his redeemed people, a temple that not even the gates of hell can ever tear down. Jesus is also the ultimate prophet, far greater than Elijah. In 1 Kings, Elijah called fire down from heaven to judge the false prophets and prove the absolute power of God. It was a necessary, dramatic moment of severe judgment under the Old Covenant. But centuries later, when the disciples of Jesus were rejected by a Samaritan village, they remembered the famous story of Elijah. They proudly asked Jesus if they should call fire down from heaven to consume the village. Jesus immediately stopped them. He turned and rebuked them. He showed that he came with a different mission. He came to save lives, offer unmerited grace, and rescue desperate sinners. The true king did not come to rain down fire upon his enemies. He came to take the terrifying fire of divine judgment upon himself on the dark wood of the cross. The story of 1 Kings is the tragic story of how a wealthy, powerful nation lost its way when it slowly stopped trusting in the Lord. But underneath all the failure, it is the beautiful story of a God who absolutely refuses to let his true people be destroyed. He kept his ancient promise to David, maintaining a light in Jerusalem. He miraculously fed his exhausted prophet by a remote, dry brook using wild birds. He quietly preserved 7,000 faithful believers in the darkest, most dangerous of times. Jesus stands forever as the true and faithful king that the people of Israel desperately needed but never had. When human leadership crumbles around us, when nations divide over bitter politics, and when the culture blindly gives itself over to false gods, we do not need to panic. We do not need to run into a dark cave and ask to die. We simply need to look to the King who reigns in perfect justice, the one whose glorious kingdom will never be divided, and whose ancient promises will absolutely never fail. If this video helped you grow deeper in God's Word, I want to personally invite you to be part of what we are building here. Every video on this channel takes many hours of study and careful research to make sure we bring you content that is faithful to Scripture and worthy of your time. If you would like to support this mission and help us keep making these videos, you can find a link in the description below to give a one-time gift or become a monthly supporter. Every gift, no matter the size, goes directly toward creating more content like this. And if you are not in a position to give right now, that is completely fine. The best thing you can do is subscribe, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and keep studying God's Word with us. Thank you for being here, and may God bless you richly.